Welcome back to our APES flipped classroom. We're continuing our discussions about land and water use. And today we're focusing on forestry, and we'll focus on two aspects of forestry, kind of your more traditional clear cutting type forestry, and then we'll address sustainable forestry and how those differ and what impact each of them has on the environment. So when we talk about clear cutting, things that we need to know. It's economically advantageous, but it has a lot of downsides, including soil erosion, increased soil and stream temperatures, and flooding. And of course, forests help to mitigate climate change by absorbing pollutants and carbon dioxide. So let's jump right in to talk about the direct effects of clear cutting. So those short-term effects of clear cutting. So one of the first aspects that jumps out when we talk about clear cutting is soil erosion. When trees are cut down, that stabilizing root structure starts to decompose. And so the soil is more easily eroded away. And that means that the organic matter in the soil and the nutrients that are in the topsoil get removed from the forest. The effect of this erosion also contributes to depositing sediments in local streams, because without that stabilizing root structure, any rain that runs over the surface just picks up the soil and just carries it right into the streams. This has the effect of warming the water and making it more turbid. So we can see in these pictures that in the areas without the trees, that the runoff is cutting paths through the forest, or what used to be forest. And you can see, particularly in this picture, just how turbid and muddy that stream is. And you can remember from when we talked about water quality that turbidity is a measure of how cloudy the water is. And when the water is more cloudy, it makes it more difficult for plants or aquatic plants to do photosynthesis, and therefore it reduces the amount of oxygen available to other living creatures in the stream. When you have this buffer of trees, even in an area where you have a lot of exposed soil, as the water runs down over the soil and picks up dirt, it is caught by this buffer of trees at the edge of the stream. And so you tend to have nice clear streams. Here, without that buffer of trees and root stabilization, the stream gets really, really muddy. So then we kind of have a double whammy, because not only are our streams more filled with sediment, it also increases temperature of both the soil and the streams. The loss of shade is going to increase both soil temperature and water temperature. And then again, we get that double whammy effect that the soil has a lower albedo, so a lower reflectivity than the leaves of the trees, which means that soil absorbs more of the warmth from the sun than trees do. That warms the soil. And then as that sediment erodes into the rivers, that also warms the rivers. So we get both the lack of shade and the increased albedo. And then at the extreme, we wind up with flooding and landslides. So the machinery that's used in logging is big, heavy equipment. When that's driven over the soil, just like we talked about with agriculture, that compacts the soil. It dries out the soil. The increased exposure to sunlight also dries out the soil. And because the topsoil is being eroded away, or that O horizon is being eroded away, you have harder, more compact subsoil, and all of those factors are going to decrease the water holding capacity of the soil. And that's going to lead to flooding, and in extreme cases, to landslides, which can be devastating both to animal habitats and to people. Whoops, my picture is missing. So a more long-term impact of forestry is the fact that when areas are clear cut, they are usually replanted, and the forestry industry likes to talk about the fact that, well, for every tree we cut down, we plant somewhere between 1 and 5 additional trees. But these are baby trees, these are saplings, and they tend to all be the same species because it's easier to replant with the same species. So we go from a very biodiverse mixed age forest to a single age forest of all the same tree, which does not provide the same level of habitat diversity for animals and other plants that might live there. And so it decreases biodiversity. That means that we're going to have lower resilience and we're going to have less habitat diversity for those other organisms that live there. When trees are all planted at the same time, they're all the same age. So that means we're not going to have those deadwood habitats for things like woodpeckers, a lot of other birds that nest in dead cavities. Insects are decomposers, so that further lowers the biodiversity. So let's talk about some of the benefits that forests provide to us. The first one is that forests and trees in general are excellent at filtering air pollutants. The stomata, or the pores of the leaves, when they open to receive carbon dioxide, also filter other pollutants out of the air, volatile organic compounds, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter. All of that gets trapped by the stomata and stored in the tree. Of course, the one that we talk about often is the removal and storage of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So in the process of photosynthesis, the trees take in carbon dioxide, they produce sugars, which they can then convert for their own energy, or they can turn into biomass, or the wood, the stems, the leaves themselves. And they store that carbon dioxide. They also release oxygen, which is important to all of the other living organisms. And here's a picture of our process. Carbon dioxide comes in, carbon gets stored in the tree, oxygen comes out. And of course, forests provide a rich habitat for lots and lots of organisms. And this is important in terms of biodiversity of our forest ecosystem. It also provides an economic benefit in terms of ecotourism. So people will pay lots of money to go and visit forests, to hike in the woods, to have those beautiful views. So there's both an ecological benefit and an economic benefit. So what are some of the consequences of deforestation? Well, obviously, we're going to lose that air filtering and carbon storing service. When we cut down trees, even when we're clear cutting, you guys can see from the image in the background here that lots of parts of the trees get left behind. Whether that's the crown, meaning the top part of the tree that's not good for lumber, the vines or other things that are caught in the trees, some of the branches that are not big enough for lumber, all of that gets stripped off and simply left on the ground. And so not only are we losing the carbon storing, but as those decompose, they actually add carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And then one of the common forms of deforestation, if we're not talking about forestry or using it for wood, is what we call slash and burn. So slash and burn is an agricultural process where areas are clear cut and then they are burned, which releases carbon dioxide, dinitrogen monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and water vapor into the atmosphere. And all of those are powerful greenhouse gases. So not only are we taking away the carbon sequestration, but we're actually adding powerful greenhouse gases back to the atmosphere. So your PracticeFRQ for this section for clear cutting is to describe 2 ecosystem services that are provided for humans. Remember, ecosystem services are services to us from our environment by forests. And then I want you to explain how clear cutting would affect each of those ecosystem services that you've described. Okay, so we've talked about the downside, clear cutting, the probably most destructive form of forestry. Let's talk about sustainable forestry. So we're going to talk about how we mitigate deforestation and how we protect forests from pathogens and insects, and what fire management is all about. So when we talk about ecologically sustainable forestry, we're talking about managing our forestry. We're talking about using trees for lumber or paper, but in a way that it minimizes the damage to the ecosystem. We want to minimize habitat destruction. We want to minimize soil erosion. So how do we do that? Well, the number one way is what we call selective cutting or strip cutting. And with selective cutting, it means that we only cut some of the trees in an area rather than clear cutting an entire area. You cut only some of the trees. Sometimes that means the biggest and oldest trees. Sometimes it actually is a selective thinning so that the trees that remain can actually get bigger and more profitable. It frequently means harvesting only a certain number of trees of each species in order to preserve the biodiversity of the habitat. Also, by only cutting some of the trees, it does preserve the topsoil because you leave some of the root structures in place to prevent erosion. So we can see this image shows us selective cutting, where we go in and cut some trees kind of mixed all the way through. Strip cutting is where exactly what it sounds like. A strip of the forest is cut and it's left alone on either side of that strip. So that area is exposed. We do have the negatives of increased albedo and decreased biodiversity, but you maintain the biodiversity on either side. And so we have sort of habitat islands, and we have protection from erosion. Taking it to the full extreme, ecologically sustainable forestry can use human or pack animal labor to minimize soil compaction from machinery. So this would be using horses and chainsaws rather than going in with heavy equipment, whether you're selective cutting or strip cutting. So here we have an image of a horse dragging a log out of the woods. Another important aspect of ecologically sustainable forestry is replanting the same species that's being logged. That allows the forest to maintain some biodiversity by replanting not just one species, but multiple species. And importantly, when we talk about ecologically sustainable forestry, it needs to be economically sustainable as well. So well done ecologically sustainable forestry will actually maximize the long-term productivity of the land. It'll preserve the forest both for the environment and for future generations. So that's where that selective cutting, in order to allow some trees to get even larger and more valuable, can come in. Okay, some other important sustainable forestry practices include finding ways to not have to cut down the trees. So using recycled wood. This is kind of a trend in decorating lately, but it can be done in ways that it's not obvious that it's recycled wood, or it can be done in ways that it is. Or you can simply reuse without recycling, without changing it. Reuse that furniture, reuse those decorations. So here we have an entire outdoor set that has been built from pallet wood, which is wood that's used obviously to make pallets, and they're repurposing it for furniture and for fencing. If wood has already been cut, it can be chipped and used as mulch for gardens or for agricultural fields, so there's less waste of wood. Obviously, reforestation is a big important piece of sustainable forestry practices. That means replanting trees in areas that have been deforested, whether that's for agricultural purposes, for forestry purposes, for whatever reason, replanting trees. And you can see this is a picture in California, actually, of an area that had been totally deforested and then has been replanted. And you can see how green it has become in just 18 years. Another important piece of sustainable forestry is protecting the forest. And so that might be selectively removing any diseased trees to prevent the spread of infection through an entire forest. It also involves integrated pest management, so that we are applying those same integrated pest management concepts that we apply in agriculture to forestry. So whether that's biological controls, mechanical controls, and chemical controls, as well as physical. So selectively removing the diseased trees falls under that physical control piece. And the reason that this is important is twofold. It removes the host for the disease, but it also decreases the density of the trees, which makes it more difficult for the disease or the parasite to spread. So here we have an example of a diseased tree that needs to be taken out so that these other trees are not affected by that disease. Another important aspect of protecting forests is fire suppression. So the attitude 20 years ago was that all fire is bad. And so all fires were put out, and the federal government put a lot of resources into suppressing all natural fires as soon as they started. You guys probably remember from your childhood Smokey the Bear saying, "Only you can prevent forest fires." The problem with suppressing all natural fires is that this leads to more biomass buildup. All of that detritus that builds up on a forest floor, if you don't have fires every so often, means there's going to be lots of dry biomass. And when you have lots of dry biomass, that is a fuel for fires, and it makes future fires worse. So if you have small, frequent fire, then it's small, it's lower temperature, and trees and rootstock are more likely to survive. When you have huge, out of control wildfires, like one we just had in Colorado a couple weeks ago, then nothing survives. The trees don't survive, the rootstock does not survive, none of the animals that lived in the area survive. So the modern approach to fire suppression is to monitor and to do what are called prescribed burns, in which small areas are burned in a contained situation to prevent worse fires in the future, to prevent that biomass buildup. So a prescribed burn, we have lots of, without prescribed burns, there's lots of fuel for forest fires, there's lots of stored nutrients that are trapped in that dead biomass that hasn't yet decomposed. And we have lots of dead trees that are susceptible to disease and to the spread of pests. And so prescribed burns are small controlled burns that burn that dead biomass, which prevents those larger forest fires later. It also has the added benefit of recycling those nutrients much faster than decomposition can. So the fire actually releases those nutrients back into the soil. Obviously, prescribed burns have to be very carefully managed and monitored. These are usually done by the Bureau of Wildlife Management or Bureau of Land Management or the U.S. Forest Service. There's a lot of cooperation now between those federal agencies and Native American tribes that have been doing prescribed burns. They actually call them cultural burns. They did them for hundreds of years before the takeover of those lands by the US government. And so there's the opportunity to learn how to better manage our forests and prevent these out of control wildfires. which is becoming an ever more important aspect as our population spreads out into areas that are more prone to wildfire. Your practice FRQ for this section is to identify 2 characteristics of a forest that develop when fires are suppressed and explain how prescribed burns could address each of those characteristics. So, as always, if you have any questions, let me know. I look forward to seeing you in class.